Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending to our Extempore PD Extravaganza this Wednesday noon session. Here to present Opening the Silos, How to Coordinate Planning and PD Across Languages. Myself, Grant Kastner, I am Extempore's Community Manager, as well as my new friend, Dr. Amanda Lanier from Michigan State University's MAFLT program. Amanda, hello.
Hi, I am delighted to be here and so glad to be part of this event. I think that virtual events like this used to be more uncomfortable and familiar for us, and now in a way they're essential. There are teachers who can't get to the big conferences, who don't have the same opportunities to build community, and that is both what is happening now and a lot of what we want to talk about. So we are both language teachers, and I'm also a language teacher trainer. And I'm going to move on through. You've got the description. We talked about the form, the presentation, and we have another link that we're going to give you, and we're going to do some more interactions in just a minute. So I'll type that in where you can find that. And so I hosted this on my program's website just for convenience. You will have the link to some slides there. They're shared slides, and we'll use those for some interaction in a minute. But we wanted to tell you sort of where this came from. And so when Grant and I started talking, it really came out of a conversation about advocacy initially. It was Thomas who contacted me. We're talking about advocacy. And then that went into, of course, because many of my conversations lately do, talking about preparation and support for teachers of less commonly taught languages and teacher isolation. So the connections really between resilience and isolation, how we deal with really what we've all been through in the last couple of years. We wish was over, but I took COVID test today because of a conference last week. So it's not over, wish it were. And so with that going on, that makes it harder to connect with other teachers when we can't go to in-person conferences, when we can't even necessarily meet with our colleagues. It's summertime, there's a little bit of disconnect there, but it's even harder when you have less commonly taught languages, when you have situations where things are shut down. But it's not that was the, I'm stumbling over my words, listen to me. It's not that is a new thing. It's not that we were all happily playing together and coordinating everything, collaborating on everything before the pandemic. It was that made it more apparent that we were all having challenges with that. I think it became apparent, but then also it has, I think, opened many of our eyes to ways that we can bridge that distance, often using virtual events and virtual community. And so Grant, we started talking, and then I interviewed him for a project I'm doing on departments of one and teacher development for less commonly taught languages. And so we thought we'd start this in a little bit of an interview format, like we did that for that. So Grant, you told me a lot about your career as a Chinese teacher, and actually, have you talked about that much in the Extempore Extravaganza? Have you talked about your...
I talk a lot about teaching Chinese and teaching languages in general, but honestly, not a whole lot about the specifics of what I do on a daily basis within school, at least this year.
Or how you got into this.
Right, yeah.
Okay. And so could you tell us about your trajectory as a Chinese teacher, getting into being a Chinese teacher? And
sure, yeah. So I did my master's program at Towson University which is in Baltimore, where I used to live in Maryland. And I got my master's degree in secondary education to teach Chinese in Maryland those first 2 years. And so when I did my master's student teaching, I really was getting my first taste, right, of what it was like to be a language teacher. And of course, at the school that I student taught at, I was the student Chinese teacher with our lead Chinese teacher, who of course was the only one, right? And then you have a bunch of Spanish teachers, a French teacher, as well as a German teacher who was also on his own. But like that was really my first taste of, wow, okay, this is sort of just how it goes, and we're doing this on our own, and I have to help the co-teach, the lead teacher. And then once I got my first job teaching at a school by myself, it really became like this whole idea of a department of one became more and more clear to me. Like, this is all on me, right? And the success and or failures of my department, of my Chinese program, it's on me and what I do and the advocacy and the work that I put in, while also at the same time trying to just manage my regular day-to-day life on top of all of the preps and things that I have to do for 4 different classes of Chinese on a daily basis.
Anybody have a reaction to that? My son likes to do this. My son does his connections reaction, but you can do a reaction thumbs up if any of that sounds familiar.
And I saw it just related, Amanda. I saw there's a Chinese Facebook group that I'm in, and there was a posting for this job, and it was only to teach Chinese 1 full time. And the reaction was like, what do you mean only Chinese 1? That sounds fantastic. How many of us all have like 4 preps that we have to manage on a daily basis? It's not just me. It's all of these these teachers of less commonly taught languages that, you know, this is what they have to do on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know that for you that there were these transitions from department to department, that you had better interaction, some of them than others. And then, you know, sometimes the program doesn't last and it's not really your fault at all.
Right.
The program's shut down under you and you can't even do a lot to stop that. I've seen a lot of really good teachers leave the field or have their programs shut down or those kinds of things. And so a lot of this, I mean, part of it is how we feel about the work and the amount of work that we have to do. And part of it is our job's still there, our program's still there.
And to add to that, Amanda, it's like a lot of this experience, it's you know, we all, as language teachers within this presentation, we all know what it's like, right? But we feel that we shouldn't have to advocate for language learning the same way that math, English, and science teachers don't have to advocate for their programs, right? Those subjects are all saying, oh, these are core content areas. We need these in our schools everywhere. Whereas a world language, if it's not, nothing against the common languages of Spanish and French, but if it's other languages, the less common ones, we have to advocate for it, or our program could be at risk. Also due to the fact that it's even harder to find teachers for that program. So administrators and others who make those decisions say, oh, not really worth it for us to pursue, let's just drop it. When at the end of the day, what are the consequences of losing a program like that? For a lot of students, having it can open so many doors for them. And then to lose it, it's you're shutting doors for them. You're closing off opportunities that they could have to learn about a new culture and a new language, and just something that, for me, from my own experience as a student when I was a teenager, totally opened my eyes to a whole new world, and as you can see, it changed my life for the better.
Yeah, and it's very much a multi-pronged effort to keep that from happening. And then what we run into at that point is it's a multi-pronged effort that, again, still falls on the teacher to do all of that advocacy work, to support the entire program, to do your recruitment, retention work, all of those things at the same time that you're teaching day to day. So I am moving this out of the way. We'll show that. And so what I run into, so I came into this, I'm an applied linguist and I do qualitative research, and more I focus on teacher development. And I teach a lot of courses online in the MAFLT program, which is a fully online program. So that means that I have students all over the US and alums all over the US and in several other countries. And this advocacy for language learning in general is very much a US phenomenon, except that in other countries, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, that you don't have to argue for English, but it's the next language that is the one that needs advocacy. In the US, advocating for language learning in general is a huge issue. And we'll show you some stats on that in just a minute. But what happened with me and coming into being a teacher trainer is that I had to learn to do all of the teacher training work online. I have students all over the place. I have a lot of students, but all of them are isolated from each other. And they teach 20 different languages. So I came into this with French, Czech, Serbian, and Arabic, and I'm learning Portuguese. And those are really, really less commonly taught languages. Some of them, Arabic is a sort of one of these middle, less commonly taught languages like Chinese and Japanese and sort of Korean and Italian and Portuguese. But learning to meet the needs of all of these different teachers meant that I had to adapt my practices and figure out what these teachers need, but also what am I doing when I'm providing prompts and providing guidance and leading through planning and activity design and reflection on teacher development and building programs, all those things that will apply across all of these different languages. So every single time I give something out to students, I have to think, is this going to work no matter what their language is or no matter what their context is? And so it's that continuous process. But we have a sense that teachers tend to form communities together with others who teach the same language. And it may be that you don't have a choice about that in your school or the opportunity about that in your school. But then when you go to look for resources and you're forming virtual communities, those kinds of things, it can also be quite frequent that you talk to people who teach the same language. And we wanted to emphasize the value of working across those boundaries, but also the value of connecting in general. It's not just about whether or not you're talking to teachers of other languages. It's about coordinating and connecting and getting support from and with other teachers at all. So this is what we mean by silos. So can we just do a thumbs up real quick on the silos? Do you have a sense that you tend to lean toward talking to people who teach the same language, or the other teachers tend to do that? Maybe you guys are, maybe we're preaching to the choir and you guys are the ones that do cross those boundaries, and it's your colleagues that might not cross those boundaries. Okay, maybe we'll give you some suggestions to help encourage other people to join you in breaking down those silos. But you see, we tend to get behind walls that separate us in so many different ways. And then how does that happen? You know, even in your classroom, that you tend to go inside your classroom and close the door of the classroom and not know what the other teachers are doing. We have a walking discussion for you. So this is something you may not have done before, but this is shared slides, and you are going to be able to create your little hashtag and then move things around. So if you click the link that I gave you, then you will see this. And you'll see that Grant created his little hashtag and I created my little hashtag. And what I like about doing this is that when we're in a virtual meeting, very often we can sit and listen, and in order for everyone to participate, we sort of have to take turns and call on people, and it's sort of what happens in the classroom, but magnified in terms of what it takes to get people participating. So this is sort of like the benefit of TPR. So we can ask you a question and everybody can respond to it in a way that we can see, without everyone trying to talk at once, which gets awkward. So good. I see some people can get in there and pick up their little avatar, and we can always copy and paste to make more of them. If there's not enough of them, I'm going to make some more of them. You don't have to do this. This is just. Okay, and then we've got your little hashtag. Copy and paste it onto the next slide. Chinese must be so hard. Grant, is Chinese hard?
It's
terribly hard.
People tell me that all the time, but the irony is that they've never taken Chinese.
Have they studied Polish?
I'm studying Polish right now. Polish.
Are you really?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. Czech is a killer language, and Polish is even worse in some ways. But they all have their. Yeah,
I chose that hashtag because it's like, you know, I tell people I teach Chinese, and it's like, that must be so hard. Like it's just what I hear all the time. Chinese must be so hard. When they don't know, it's just this really bad assumption that they have about the language.
And also the story that students get, which is that it's a hard language. I'm going to fail that class. I can't take that class because it'll hurt my GPA.
Exactly.
And then your most advanced students won't take your class because they're afraid it'll hurt their GPA. All right, so when you're ready, take your that little shape and copy and paste it onto the next slide. I'm going to ask you some questions. My cheat sheet. Move the cheat sheet. They can see it. All right. So if you agree, then you're going to move your little avatar to the side that is agree. And if you are going to disagree, move your little avatar to the left. So try not to move the pictures in the background. Number one, my target language is very hard to learn. So move your little avatar to, so Grant is way over on the right. No, okay. According to other people versus according to you. Okay, so according to you, your target language is really hard to learn. All right, I'm gonna think about Czech, and I'm gonna say, yep, it's over there. Or Arabic. I think for a variety of reasons, Arabic is hard to learn. It's a beautiful language. I love learning more about it and how much I understand about it. I do not speak it very well, but there's a lot of things about Arabic, and it's not just the grammar, it's the sociocultural aspects of grammar, and I'm going to delete that. Thank you. Okay, somebody fix their own mistake.
I'm just gonna add, Amanda, if you guys are still struggling on the previous page, just make sure you copy the whole box. The whole box. That's all, not just your text.
The words. Okay,
Yeah,
just your name. Okay.
Grab the,
so, yeah, so far so good though. It's going okay. I'm going to go to the next question. So if you jump in on the next question, that's cool. All right, so now you're just going to move again and answer to this one. So my target language is harder to teach than other languages. If you think your target language is harder to teach than other languages. All right, somebody click Control Z because you just duplicated. Okay, there you go.
Harder
just
to
move your little figure. All right, so if you agree, it's harder to teach, and I'm gonna kind of sit in the middle over there. I don't know that it's harder to teach. I think Chinese is harder to teach.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
It's just different.
Okay. Okay. All right. So Junmei, you changed your mind. Want to talk about why you changed your mind? You can unmute. Junmei, am I saying it? Am I pronouncing it badly?
Chunmei.
Okay.
I'm here.
Hi. So why'd you
Hi.
move? Why'd you change your mind?
Just a typo.
Oh, that you just hadn't decided where you wanted to see it.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So if you teach a critical language, I'm going to delete where somebody changed. Okay. If you teach a critical language, so just move your figure. So you're copying and pasting from here to the next page. Jen, I'm going to do it for you. Nope, no, you already did it. Beautiful. Okay. The next one, if you teach a critical language, if your language is considered to be a critical language. So Spanish is a very frequently taught language, it's an important language, but does the government consider it a critical language?
Not critical.
Not critical. It does not mean that your language is not important if it is not a critical language, but is it considered a critical language by the government, which means that you're getting particular kinds of support from the government for your language, or that it has particular geopolitical significance. Is your language a critical language?
Oh, this is very factual.
Well, I'm learning Portuguese now, and so I'm going to put that over there. Portuguese is a critical language. Who else? Chinese is a critical language.
Yeah, Chinese critical language. I don't know how to move.
How to move your figure?
Yeah.
So you just click on it and drag it over.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. And then if your language is a heritage language, if you teach a heritage language, so you have heritage learners in your classes. They're heritage learners in your classes.
To a degree, Amanda, couldn't they all be heritage languages?
Well, they are all heritage languages in the US because there are people who speak them as heritage languages. I have my own definition for heritage learners. So heritage means that you have that your cultural identity is tied to the language. And I define that broadly because, for example, I would say that someone who is Muslim learning Arabic might say that their cultural identity is tied to Arabic, even though they speak Tamil at home.
Oh, sure.
That was one of the families in my dissertation. Something like Hindi. So I have a colleague who teaches Hindi, and he will say that you might come and learn Hindi because your family is from India and the language you speak at home could be many, many other languages, and you're still a heritage learner of Hindi to some extent. But heritage meaning that usually you're exposed to it through your family. Usually that's what the definition is, that you're exposed to it through your family. So lots of heritage learners. And one of the features of less commonly taught languages is that very often you can't have a separate track for heritage learners. That's one of the things that is similar across less commonly taught languages. We're going to move along. All right. And we have our results over here that we were looking at, reasons that you don't collaborate, and we will come back to that in a minute. So these are some things we wanted to ask you. You know what, let's ask that question before we move on. So for your language, this is the one more question I want to ask. I'm going to copy and paste you. Do you have the sense that your language program is well supported by the administration at your school? Is your program supported and resourced well? And I know that might be a little uncomfortable to answer. Maybe we shouldn't ask that question. Maybe your administrators know that. Maybe it's no surprise. Okay. So is that people not moving, or they are agreeing that your program is resourced well? And one more, how many of you are the only one who does what you do at your school? If you're the only one who does what you do at your school. The only one who does what you do. Grant's the only one who does what he does. Lauren, Chinmay, Cami.
Promise you the other Chinese teachers are probably.
I'm not anymore the only one who does what I do with teaching.
Not the only one.
I have great people who work with me now. Great, okay. Okay, so a mix of that. All right, we need to move along. Okay, great. Okay, guys, we will also fill things in places that we have to share with you. But let's go on with the content here. So even though we might be in a very large department or a very small department, I'm increasingly aware that even in very large departments, you often have trouble coordinating with other teachers, and for a variety of reasons. So it may be that you don't have time to work together. It may be that you don't have leadership, vision, guidance to support that. Many teachers don't even have a planning period. So how could they observe another teacher or meet properly with other teachers? You may have a sense that you can't coordinate your planning. There's lots of things that keep us from connecting with other teachers. And this is, I'm just showing you a couple of other presentations recently, just so you know that this has been on my mind, that there are other presentations that have more content on this, that are looking at what it feels like, what it means when you are the only one who does what you do. And all of these things that come into play for running a language program are on one teacher who has to make the planning decisions and the recruitment decisions and do the advocacy and do the budget and do, lead the study abroad program and choose the materials or create materials, all the things. Who's going to supervise you? Who's going to give you ideas about how to grow? And then for the other one here, this is about ways that you can advocate for the program. You can do those things without completely adding to the work that you're already doing. And so one of the reasons why we don't tend to coordinate with teachers of other languages is that we think of the languages being so separate from each other. The languages themselves are so different. And so when we talk about less commonly taught languages, they have a number of features in common so that you can look at this collection of languages with similar needs and similar practices around those less commonly taught languages. And it's not inconsequential that when a language is less commonly taught, but it is still taught, when it is provided, even though it's not one of the most commonly taught languages, what are the reasons for that? What is going on when that happens? And so quite often it's because it's a critical language or because it's an important heritage language in that area, because there's local tradition around it. So there's a lot of areas that have Italian history or German history, or that have a lot of immigration from particular areas. And that is why that language is taught in that area, or there's international appeal. There's some particular narrative in that area about the value of that language internationally, or things like Japanese, where you have the anime and the manga is the international appeal. We call it the cultural supermarket when you're attracted to those sorts of aspects of the language. I hear that a lot from Japanese teachers, and Korean more and more now. But LCTLs, so the landscape of language teaching across the country is a little out of balance in terms of which languages are taught. And again, there's no criticism of Spanish teachers in any way whatsoever. I think the sense that I have sometimes is that we have resources for Spanish teachers, and there's not so much of a voice for teachers of other languages around particular topics. And if you're going to have a large department in any program across the country, it's likely to be a Spanish department as opposed to another language. At universities, you might get a big French department, maybe a few in German, not usually a large department in other languages. But you can see these are the rates of these different languages. And still in higher ed, 7 out of every 100 students is enrolled in a language. Not many really. And so one of the important things here is that we need to band together in general to promote language learning and teaching. It's not just about promoting less commonly taught languages or making sure that teachers and programs are supported. And if you look, I find this kind of encouraging to see where the LCTLs are taught across the country. Is it surprising to anybody that there's really this many? So above 100 schools teaching LCTLs in these pink states. the 60 to 99 range in these dark blue states. And so if you feel kind of isolated in your state, maybe this is encouraging that you find there are a lot of schools that do teach LCTLs in your state. Maybe you could reach out to those or look at the database and see what languages those are and where those schools are. So one of the things that comes up and that came up some yesterday, we're thinking about how we decide what we can do with learners and how they're going to progress. Things like the seal of biliteracy, deciding what it means when you have earned the seal of biliteracy and how much credit you should get for that. All of these things kind of come back to what we believe about how difficult the language is and how long it takes to learn the language. And so we may think that our languages are very different from each other. And it is true that certain languages are going to take much longer than others to learn. And that when you look at this, this is not based on real statistics, this visual. So it's a really helpful visual, but it's not necessarily based on actual numbers for how long it takes learners to get to the advanced range. And it might be much more true of commonly taught languages, which are closer to English than it is of languages that are more distant from English. And so what happens with languages that are less commonly taught is not just that there's not a tradition of having those programs and large programs for those languages, but that they are more distant from English. And so that does make it more difficult in a lot of ways to shepherd learners through that learning process and to show success and to measure proficiency and to develop their skills, because it is farther away from English. And we have to acknowledge that and be aware of that and be alert to that and be able to explain that to others. Because if they come along and say, well, why aren't you performing like at this other class over here? You need to be able to explain why that's happening, that there's greater linguistic difference. Actually, again, we might be preaching to the choir and your groups are performing better anyway, because you're teaching very well. But again, these estimates of what languages are harder than others really are based on sort of limited context and limited data. And so a lot of what we believe about what separates languages from each other and what makes them harder and what might make a course harder, a lot of it is based on the experience of learners, but not necessarily what has to be the case. And so for these, if you've seen this before, the categories of languages, this isn't even necessarily something that the Foreign Service Institute promotes, but those come from the idea that you have adults in intensive study over a period of many, many weeks, or trying to get to a certain level of proficiency so that they can go work abroad, which is not at all the same kind of situation in which you are teaching students in a K-12 program. So you don't have as many hours per week. You don't have the same types of learners. You don't have the same motivations. You don't have the same skills at language learning. And so we can't necessarily use these sort of prominent descriptors that are out there in the discourse of how we determine how difficult a language is, because these don't necessarily line up with what the actual experience is going to be of learners in our classrooms. But it is helpful to say this still is pretty likely that the ones that are toward the right end of this spectrum are going to take longer. You're going to have I don't want to say a harder path, but you're going to have a longer path for those. And again, we want to be able to articulate that to others and say, we need time to do this, but for a variety of reasons. All right. And honestly, I can't tell you how long it's going to take for your particular learners to get to a certain level of proficiency. And those are things that are just now, we're going to be able to talk about this a lot better as more states that adopt the seal of biliteracy and things like that. So more standardized tests are being used. We're going to have better data for that, but we still don't have great data for that. But when we perceive language to be harder, it's often because of linguistic distance, that we looked at those language families, and here the language families are farther apart from others. And even recently, I'm hearing a lot about how much harder French is than Spanish. And I mean, I get it where that's coming from, but it's just that the spelling is harder, but it's very regular. And with all of these, we can turn the narrative around, that it's not as hard as we think it is to learn these languages. Writing systems. this is one of the things that's very, very different and that can be very complicated, and that will be one of the things that separates what you can do and what you're going to do from what other languages and teachers do, is the writing systems. And so when you come to literacy, you're going to have different decisions to make, and it's going to be important to make different decisions regarding how you balance the multiple skills. And so again, taking that into account, but not handling literacy separately from the focus on proficiency and communication overall. All right, so I wanted to show you how frequent these are. We're going to skip ahead just a little bit. But when we're looking at what separates teachers out, this is, to an extent, this is a schematic of the sizes of departments we might run into, the numbers of languages, language departments, numbers of language learners that we might see in a given context. And we can see that we have languages that are the commonly taught languages. We have languages that are less commonly taught. We have languages that are real lictals. So you might have someone, real lictals, that's not really fair either, but the ones that are probably not offered in a program, where you might have someone supervising learners learning by themselves. Does anyone have that context, where you have someone who maybe points the students to Rosetta Stone, and that is the language program for that? Or the lictal programs at Michigan State, we have several situations where there's a language shared across institutions and providing better support for that. But when we have lictal teachers, what do the lictal teachers have in common with each other in terms of how the work plays out? And so again, this is going back to what we were saying, that it's not exclusive to less commonly taught languages that you end up isolated, or that you end up in a situation where it's more difficult for you to get support and to do your job in context. But it happens often with lictal teachers that you find yourself in a smaller department, that you find yourself, there's a non-traditional career path, lots of career changers who are native speakers and then change into the field, that you're more responsible for your materials and your curriculum design than teachers of other languages, because there just are not as many published materials available to you. You might be teaching heritage or critical languages, but the heritage languages, you can't separate them out from your non-heritage learners, and there's not a separate track for that. So you have to be able to handle the differences among those learners within your classroom. Lots of things that are in common with lictal teachers. I am ignoring the chat. Yeah, where's my Slovak speaker?
I got it, Amanda. I got it.
Yep, you're looking at the chat?
Yep, I got it.
Yep, we can talk later about Slovak and Czech and Serbian and Croatian and Bosnian and all those. Then, okay, so good. All right, I'm seeing, okay. And so is there something else that you think is true of you as a lictal teacher that's not true of teachers of commonly taught languages? Okay.
I think, yeah, you have the item of limited options for materials. I think one of the things that sort of rings true for me that I think is easy to pass over, particularly as a Chinese teacher, when it comes to like authentic resources and being able to actually use them in my classes, getting them for the novice level, novice low, novice mid, even novice high level, it's next to impossible, because the thing is, there are no cognates. I think that's something to really consider, right? I have practically no cognates in Chinese. And even if it is a cognate, you might not even know right away that it's supposed to be a cognate. And so anytime I find materials that I can use, it's a matter of how many words can they pick out versus how much can they actually understand from this whole thing. Even like one of the common sources that I like to use for my upper levels when I have the chance is there are these databases with, it's called 小学作文. It's like all of these elementary essays that kids in China write, and they're all over the internet. There's millions of them, literally. But even within these essays, which are like 100, 150, 200 characters long, there's still so many new words that I would have to teach in order to actually use it in the class without overwhelming my students. So there's just
don't mean that you're going to teach them every word they're going to need before you give them that material. They don't need to understand every word.
Well, that's the thing, right? But then how do I measure that with student confidence, right? And I give them something to say, oh, hey, you should be able to read this, and then they can't, right? And how do you balance that when it comes to really finding materials versus saying, well, you shouldn't be creating your own materials? Well, but I'm like, but I'm using what they need to know and the words that I feel that they should learn. And it's hard for me to find stuff like that online, and they speak really fast and the writing's really different. A lot of things coming together.
One thing that comes up a lot when I'm talking about programs and to this kind of context, we're talking about programs as a whole, you start pulling on one thread talking about one aspect of a program and it ends up bringing up all these other things. So bringing up literacy or bringing up authentic materials and when and how to use authentic materials and all those things. And so I know all of these things are interconnected, and that piece of how to decide what material you can use, especially when you're trying to create your own materials. That's one of those things where you want to go and grab these really compelling, interesting, exciting, authentic materials. But each time you decide to do that, you're creating a lot of work for yourself.
Yeah.
So wouldn't it be nice if more often you could coordinate with others and be pulling in that material as a group and creating things to do with it? Yeah, I mean, and we can't get into all of the pieces that are connected, that are going to come up with those things that we would like to be able to do with others. But if we're talking about isolation, then I think it's important for you to also to see how your work is interconnected with others. And we're kind of coming back to this idea of the narrative that you present about your language, that if you present the narrative and you support the narrative that your language is very difficult, then that's not going to be helpful to anyone. Or this narrative is very, very different from English, or it's very, very different from other languages, or it's harder than other languages. Those things don't have to be true. And that's certainly not the narrative that you need to emphasize to your other stakeholders. And so we'll come back to this in a minute, but looking at how we cultivate people who are in support of our program and make sure they understand what we're doing and what goes into that and what it takes to succeed in that. That we want to make sure the narratives that are being shared and that we're presenting about our language and our language learning process are more accurate or more fair representations of what it's really like to go through the process of learning that language, and then that what we do with the learners is effective. So in doing that, you shouldn't be alone, even if you are the only teacher who does what you do, because the teachers of other content and your guidance counselors and your administrators and your students and your past students and your future students and your parents and your district coordinators and your peers at other schools and your school boards and your virtual communities are all connected to you in some way and can help you with that workload and with that narrative that you want to present. So we can get through the things that separate teachers from each other. And we pulled together some things that we think are likely to be similar across languages. You're going to use similar standards. You're going to use, you have the same underlying processes of language learning. The SLA is the same. Classroom management often is very similar across languages. Language classes can be different from non-language classes. Also, intercultural competence is something that is very similar. Culture is not, but intercultural competence is as a skill set. And then there are things that are farther apart. So like we said, literacy is farther apart. Dealing with literacy is going to be farther apart. You're going to be less likely to coordinate with other teachers on that. Motivators and goals are going to differ in some patterns, in some ways. They're going to be similar. Teacher preparation and support for in-service teachers, there are going to be similarities, but it's going to be a little more different because of what you have access to in your larger communities, the way you deal with heritage learners and who they are, how many you have, whether your language is a critical language or not. So your students might have access to scholarships that other students wouldn't have, or that you might have a Star Talk program that you can draw upon, or those kinds of things that happen with critical languages and not with others. And then published materials. So what you have access to, these are things that are farther apart for these various languages. Yeah. And then here are some recommendations based on what we understand about what is more similar across languages and more different across languages. This is where we get into things that we can actually do that can allow you to coordinate with teachers of other languages. And again, that connect to our lives as teachers so that we have the support and we have energy coming into us and we have the ability to continue doing what we do. And then also so that we can lighten the load of the actual teaching and we can convey that narrative that our languages are essential and they're a part of a well-rounded education. So you can plan together, you can learn together, you can reflect together, and you can advocate together. And we want to lean into that in discussion with you. So we're coming up toward the end of the time that we had allocated to have in the presentation part of it, but we've already dipped into some interaction with you. And so we have this Padlet for you where you can put in ideas for things that you can do with other teachers that would help to strengthen what you do, reduce the workload for what you do, have those kinds of interconnections across languages. And so you can access that we will come back to it in just a minute. We can drop the link in there in the chat as well.
Already did, Amanda.
Okay, great, thank you. So planning together, for example, so standards, your topics and themes can be similar. It's good to go and ask the content area teachers, IB, for example, knowing what those content area teachers are doing and aligning what you're doing in your language class with them can be helpful, and also give you some community, give you ways to support, to convey how essential what you're doing is and tied to other things they're learning. Like I said, intercultural competence is one of those things where you can emphasize the overall skill set that you are developing. That when you choose assessments, the way that you use assessments, the rubrics that you're using, these are all things that you can decide together. And certainly the national standards, so when you look at the World Readiness Standards from MAFLT and you look at the can-do statements, most state standards at this point do align with those and will have definitions of proficiency, definitions of what we are trying to achieve with our learners that are mostly in line with each other. A lot of teachers are not implementing that in the same way. They're not interpreting it in the same way. So all of your colleagues might not interpret that with the same definition of proficiency and what we're trying to accomplish. But for the most part, those standards, they do apply across languages. It may take longer to move from level to level, but the way that progresses, the kinds of things you can expect novice learners to do, intermediate learners to do, those things will be the same. And then one of these ideas that has come up recently and a good bit in the last year is that if you want to bring your planning together, in a way you can reach out beyond what you're doing with your language learning and teaching to some broader themes that are interdisciplinary, that are going to be appealing to teachers of other content areas, and bring those in as themes, bring those in as inspiration. And at that point, that can make the whole learning process seem more connected and real world relevant and essential to your learners. It can give you opportunities to connect with teachers of other content areas. It can give you more of a narrative to share with your other stakeholders and so on. So this is just one example, but where you're sort of developing these projects that have a broader scope. Grant, I want you to talk specifically, please, about where you have very deliberately planned a project together.
Sure. Yeah. So this is it all comes back to intercultural competence. And for those of you who joined earlier, one of my colleagues, now friend Joey, is in this session as well, and I invited him to share a little bit about this, if time permits, of course, Amanda. But intercultural competence is cross-cultural, right? I teach Chinese, Joey teaches Spanish, but there are various things across the languages and across the cultures that you find no matter where you are, no matter who you're interacting with, right? And one of the biggest points and most important, it's particularly at a beginning unit for novice learners, is names, right? That's when you take a language course, that's always what comes up. How do you greet someone? How do you say your name? How do you ask someone's name? How do you introduce yourself, right? We all do that. It's one-on-one language. And so this really turned it, when I teach this, I like to give my students resources and we talk about it, what it means culturally, right? There are all sorts of articles online about respecting people's names. And last year, there were instances of discrimination and violence against the Asian American community. And one of the things that came up was, well, if you want to respect these people, learn how to pronounce their names. Try to actually get to know them and not just say, oh, I'm going to butcher your name. Oh, I don't know how to pronounce this. Oh, can I call you this instead? Those are all examples of disrespect towards them and towards their cultures. So part of this lesson is saying, okay, what can we do? How can we learn to better pronounce people's names? And how should we approach these types of situations with our students and with people in the outside world? And so this project that you see here, you see two little posters that my students made, excuse me. I could not come up with something this nice. But they had to make a PSA, right, about respecting people's names. And once they did that PSA, what we did, and I worked with Joey, is that we did a little cross-teaching class where we would come in and the students would share information about names and pronunciation of the language and how just to better respect people from those cultures. Joey, did I miss anything on that?
No, I think you nailed it perfectly. And the best part about it is, like, I remember it being unannounced with our classes too, which made it even more fun. But it was definitely a very relevant lesson for the students. And I think a lot of students could just relate to it because they have name, they experienced it. They experienced it themselves. So that's what I noticed myself.
Yeah, and yeah, like when I'm doing this, one of the things that I ask my students is, simply raise your hand if somebody has mispronounced your name before. right? So it's not just the people in Chinese culture or Spanish culture or whatever culture you're teaching. It's the people in our class right then and there who experience it on a daily basis of somebody trying to give them another name or improperly pronouncing their name. So this is something it's just so relevant for the students. And for me, it's just a really basic goal. Like, okay, if you learn anything this year, my goodness, just learn how to pronounce a Chinese person's name, please, right? So
and then I
that's
think what's
really
interesting about this is, so the way that you both saw that need, you both saw things that you could do to meet that need. We're seeing a lot of English here. And so it may look like you would then end up relying on English really heavily if you're going to do something.
Right. So the idea is that since it's a PSA, we want to share it with the school, right? And so because of that, the resource should be in English. But then I literally, Joey can confirm this, pasted these outside of my classroom in the hall for everybody to see once they completed them, to say, hey, this is why you should respect people's names. And I have to think that it would resonate with people who, like I said, have names that are constantly mispronounced and that people don't really seem to care about how it should be pronounced. And so the students there, the goal behind this was to give some tips on why and how to respect people's names, and then also tips on just basic Chinese pronunciation as well. So like if you see an X or a Q or something unusual, how that could be pronounced.
And what's really beautiful about this, when you start thinking about how this brings together a lot of the things that we've been talking about, is that here you have a Chinese teacher and a Spanish teacher who have created a project together, who not only did the project together, so they could make a lot of the decisions about that project, the design of the project, and how it gets articulated to students and all those things together. Things are difficult in proportion to the number of decisions you have to make. So you reduce your decisions, you reduce the complexity of the project, but then it also is something that very organically is then shared with the entire school. And so what you are then using this project to convey, and can use this project to convey, is that what you're doing in your language class is much more than proficiency. You don't leave proficiency behind, but what you're doing in your class is essential to this overall well-rounded education, and that it opens up the doors of your classroom. It brings down the walls of your classroom to the rest of your school. And so what we're getting from this is not just the benefit of teachers coordinating with each other, not just the benefit of students working on this wonderful example of intercultural awareness and teaching intercultural awareness to others and respect to others, but it's also giving you an opportunity to do that advocacy piece, that promotion piece of making sure that your entire school community knows about the benefits that you're bringing to those learners, and that what they're doing in their language class is going to impact them throughout their lives. It's not limited to what you're doing in the language class. And so again, when we talk about that narrative that we have going around language learning, and the sense that we can set it to the side or isolate, or that we can, or that we're isolated as teachers, we can break those down by shifting that narrative in terms of what it is that we're trying to accomplish in the class.
And that's really the ideal, Amanda, is just getting them to see that this applies to their daily lives as well, and not just with the four walls of the classroom.
Yeah. We wanted to get into, I don't know, Grant, what do you want to do about talking about how you can?
Well, we are tight on time, but
we are. So taking up learning together. So I don't think we have to make the case for this too strongly, that people are coming to, if they're coming to the sessions and the Extempore Extravaganza, I think they're aware that they can learn from other teachers. And but I heard from a lot of my students that the ones that weathered the pandemic better were the ones that already had better practices around collaborating with other teachers. So they were communicating more, they were connecting more, that with every single app they took up, every practice they took up, the platforms they were using, that they were in communication with each other and sharing that. And the ones that had better communication and coordination in place weathered the pandemic better than others. It wasn't just about being tech savvy. It was about the sharing and what made that possible. And for one student, her entire program just had a text chain going. They were texting all day, every day, texting to share those things. Others, you can create an entire platform. You can be using something like Extempore, and you're all feeding activities into that and sharing that across your programs. If you have more ideas about that, then you can stick them on the Padlet or put them in the chat, and we'll add them where it can be shared. But these are some really specific examples of things that you could design.
I can share a little bit about it. Yeah, so within Extempore, for those of you who don't know, it's an assessment platform. You can use it to assess reading, writing, speaking, listening, all 3 modes of communication: interpersonal, interpretive, presentational. And these are just a couple examples of what you could do. And the idea behind learning together and using the Extempore platform is that you can create your own assessments together, but also share templates of those assessments, share assessment ideas, share hacks on how you can make efficient assessments. One of the presentations that I did on Monday talked about making creative assessments on Extempore, which also just save you time at the end of the day for your assessments and not making these really long, lengthy assessments that take a while for students to complete and at the same time take a long time for you to grade. And so just sharing ideas across the platform, I mean, we all know that, right? Collaboration, sharing ideas. But when you use the platform, you can really, one, use it to assess your students and provide valid assessments for them, while also using it as a evidence tool to say, hey, this is what my students can do. Check out how much progress that they've made over the years, and then sharing those types of assessments, whether horizontally with teachers who teach the same language in the same course, or just use, like I said, the templates with perhaps a teacher of another language and say, well, hey, you could use this style of assessment with your students. So yeah, so Extempore is really flexible, really versatile for those things. We have all sorts of resources for doing that, whether it's our Commons, which is our assessment database, and other sharing features. And yeah, it's a really valuable tool for collaboration, particularly across languages.
In the MAFLT program, we have a lot of technology in the program that we expect learners to learn, and we are constantly looking at new tools to bring into the program. But at this point, we very deliberately will make sure that one person goes and tries it first and then reports back to the other faculty, rather than all of us jumping on the bandwagon of a new tool at the same time, because that gives us time to see how it's working and gives us time to get input from that person. And then we start having multiple people take it up and compare how it's going. And that's where we get into this piece, is how you reflect with others. So when I was preparing for this, I went to a few different people who I know who are teacher trainers or who are district supervisors, chairs of large departments. And one thing that came up is that one thing you can do that is going to be one of the sort of easiest things to connect around is reflection. That if you just have a peer you can talk to, and that you can go and interact around the challenges you're facing and how to deal with those challenges, those kinds of things, that is a really, really valuable and important thing to do. And the one thing that I would want to promote, to suggest to you, is that if you're going to say we're meeting in a PLC, we're doing these things, we're connecting in a PLC, we're using deliberate practices, or you're using rubrics that are available for us to evaluate ourselves and others. But if you're going to do that and you're going to meet in a PLC to do that, make sure that your PLC is a professional learning community, and that it's not just a meeting, and it's not just a venting session, and that it's not the time when you do all of your logistical planning, that it is designed to be that learning opportunity. And that in addition to that, you have work that you're doing so that you can give feedback to your peers, and that you build practices around that over time so that you can be more supportive of your peers. And I know that's difficult to do. It's something that you work into your school practices and culture over time. And that is something that you often have to go to your administration on, to say, give us time to do this, give us resources to do this. We will go together to your administration and say, we are all going to be a stronger department. We are all going to be happier. We're all going to be more successful. Our learners are going to be more successful if you will provide that kind of support to all of us as a team, as a group. I hope a lot of you are experiencing that, but if you are not, then actually we would like to help you with advocacy resources to help you do that. And so things we can point you to from here. One is that my program shares advocacy resources. This is a Padlet that you can actually add to. You can go here. This is part of creating a narrative around the value of language learning. And so when we're talking about that narrative and how you would go to your many stakeholders and promote your language with your many stakeholders, this is meant to give you some talking points. It's meant to give you content to work with and some ideas for that. And then just encouragement to connect. So we talked about all of these different ways, many different ways that you can connect with others. We would like to hear more about ways that you are doing that, and would recommend to others that you can and should do that. And that's why we have this Padlet. So that gives us a way to continue the conversation. if you'll go to the Padlet, so do you know how to use your QR codes? If you hold up your phone and use the camera icon on the camera app on your phone, then it will recognize the QR code, and that should take you to the app on your phone. And then also we will give you the link to the Padlet directly.
We have a couple of responses already.
Yeah, and I would love it if you continued adding to it. I will check back and we will follow up with you if there are things on there that you want to discuss more. If you guys want to talk to me more, or I know Grant's busy. The only reason I'm saying me is that I know how busy Grant is this week. This is we're not going to use the word that you use to describe this week. It's an intense week. But I am very glad to provide a platform and a space to talk about these things more if you want to follow up with me. And we do that regularly. We have meetups with the MAFLT program, and I have teachers of every language. So whatever your language is, just about, that's not true. Not every language. I don't have Czech and Slovak right now. There are many, many languages other than the 20 that we do have. But to encourage you to let us know if you want to have more conversations about this, you're looking for input on that. So I am trying to get back to sharing the actual screen of the Padlet that we were talking about. But Grant, I think we need to wrap up. And so
You need to wrap up. Amanda, would you mind showing the feedback slide so that we can get some feedback on what we've done?
I'm just checking this out.
I have it open too.
Great. Okay. I will go back to the Padlet and make sure that on the Padlet and also on the other link that I gave you that you have contact information and some more about how you could follow up with us, but you can also let us know in the chat there. So this is lots of references and links for you, and we will share this with you. And then here is the feedback.
I know, yeah, I noted in the chat that the slides are already uploaded to the Sketch platform. They'll be right there. And then of course, here for our feedback form, if you don't mind taking some time to scan the QR code, the link is in the chat as well for the feedback form. You can get an entry into our giveaway, one of 5 $50 gift cards that we'll be offering for teachers to restock on for school this year. And as well, if you use hashtag #ExtemporePD in the chat. On Twitter, you can also be entered into the drawing as well. So a total of 4 entries. Fill out the form 3 times, not for this presentation, for each different presentation that you attend. And you can get up to 4 entries to earn a $50 gift card. I believe on behalf of Amanda, thank you all so much for attending. This has been wonderful talking with you all. Some really good interaction and communication. We have so many other offerings on hand for our 2022 PD Extravaganza, some already uploaded to YouTube, many more to come, both today and tomorrow. Hope to see you there. Amanda, anything else?
Well, I just want to say thank you for letting me do this with
you. Of course.
And I'm so glad that, you said new friend at the beginning, but I'm so glad that we had these conversations and then got into your experience and background and what's brought you into doing this. And
absolutely.
And guys, I really love learning more about your language programs. And so if there's anything I can do to connect with you guys and to help you connect with other teachers, then please reach out. And Grant, thank you so much for doing this and all the work you're putting in this.
Of course. I believe I don't want to say we don't have time for Q&A, because if you guys have any questions, comments, please feel free to share before we wrap up. I'm sure there might be a question or two.
Yeah. We went over a little yesterday, and I don't want to keep you from going to another session, but if somebody
I made sure to put breaks in between sessions, so I think we're okay.
I'm going to stop sharing.
Okay. That's fine.
Anybody want to unmute and just talk to us? What came up for you?
Unmute. Talk to us.
Let's see. May, are you still here? May, what came up for you? Oh, she's already taken off. I keep my eyes out for my Arabic teachers. I know I have my biases.
Yes, I am here.
Okay.
Hi, how are you?
Hey.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. I like the idea of coordinating with other teachers. I met with a Japanese teacher, and we are trying to do a teaching circle that meets maybe 3 times a semester. Both of us are busy, and as you said, it is not only teaching, it is everything. We do everything, yeah. So it's great to see other teachers are working together, and maybe it can be extended not only to languages, to other fields. This is very important, like we're thinking sometimes to coordinate with physics or with math. I don't know how, but there is a trend now going to business language, which is very important. Thank you.
Thank you, May.
Absolutely, yeah. That's what we're saying about those larger themes, that when you can pick up those larger themes about like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or climate change in general, or looking at multinational businesses, those kinds of things. If you look at examples from Liz Matchett and Ningjin, they were talking about the coffee industry. Liz Matchett has done an extensive project where she has her students know it's chocolate. They look at chocolate and she brings in chocolate from particular regions and then looks at the whole journey of that chocolate from its origin to where you can purchase it. And that becomes a theme for lots of things that they can do as tasks and that use their communicative modes and that really stay close to that language learning process and journey, but that bring these larger themes so that you're seeing how you might use your language in those contexts. You see what's going on in countries where that language is spoken. You see how things are interconnected. So you see how important it is for you to be able to communicate with others. Anytime you can bring in something like that and inspire learning with something that's very real world relevant, it helps you in your class, but then it's gonna be that commonality with your social studies teacher or your math teacher or your physics teacher, your like we said, that the AP themes will bring that up, the IB practice. Anybody an IB teacher? That's another thing where if you look at the themes and the way that you want to develop the individual in an IB framework, then that's very much something that happens in your language class just as much, if not more, as it happens in other classes. What are some other ideas? Okay, yeah, do not hesitate to take off.
I can share one more. I talked to my friend Chinese teacher and she said she created a lesson that is based on restaurants, like how do you order and what is the company doing regarding taxes. So all her theme was about restaurant. And really this is very inspiring to me as I'm teaching a 4th year Arabic. I was thinking what to do, there aren't any books or textbooks at that stage, or even if they are not very creative as the one you mentioned about the chocolate company and about the restaurant that was shared with my Chinese teacher.
Arabic is tricky. So if you're not using Al-Kitab, it's hard to know what to use. And also with Arabic, deciding which variety of the language to teach and your program's policy about that can be really difficult to get around. I've had a lot of Arabic teachers who were making me translate articles word by word. That is not communicative. For you, it's not so much just about finding the material out there, but working on your skills in backward design and task-based language teaching, so that when you have decided what that theme is, what that content is that you want to work with, that you are then better prepared. You have more tools in your toolkit for turning that content and those skills that you want your learners to have into a whole learning sequence. So turning what you want to do into activities, units, syllabi. Does that make sense? So if you look at backwards design, if you look at integrated performance assessments, if you look at, so Catherine Ritz's book is in the references. If you look at Catherine Ritz's book, there's some good material there about backwards design. Once you've got a task you want your learners to be able to do, how you build your planning around that task.
Yes, I did do that, and I presented in London 2 weeks ago about backward design in writing. It was the first time using it for my 3rd year Arabic, and really it worked really well. Thank you so much for sharing all these ideas. I really like them. Appreciate it.
I would love to get that. If you want to share that, I would love to see it. So if you have materials to share that, we're gonna duck out because people are tired and want to take off. And you know how to reach us if you want to. So thanks again for being here, and we appreciate you. That's the main message. Yeah. And we'll look forward to communicating with you further.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Grant.